Hello and welcome, friends, to Nashville Demystified. Nashville Demystified is a show in which I get to know my home better by talking with the folks who live, work, agitate, and make art here. I am your host, Alex Steed. If you are liking this show and you think you're going to listen again, please subscribe. If you really like the show, or you think you're going to listen again and you want to support the show, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much. I'm told that that's helpful. We'll see. Today we'll talk with Steven Hale, the great and prolific Nashville Scene journalist. The last time I talked with Steven, he told us about his beat covering the death penalty here in Tennessee. This was back in 2019, and it wasn't just a favorite conversation for this show. It was like a favorite conversation, period. I learned so much, and it just felt important, and Steven's work is incredibly important. So I was so happy to ask him back. And when I did, I asked him to come and talk about COVID in state prisons, which is something that Steven has covered extensively. It's certainly something I want to talk about in the future. But when we caught up, he was just finishing his story about the proliferation of fentanyl poisoning and its impact on record rates of drug overdoses in this local scene, and it turns out nationally, because the piece came out a little over a week ago now, and since, the New York Times has reported on the trend nationally, indicating that a record number of Americans, 100,000 Americans, died from April 2020 to April 2021. That a record number of Americans have died of drug overdoses in the time that we've been going through the pandemic. And a substantial reason for that has been the proliferation of drugs cut with fentanyl. But more on that shortly. I am, again, by the way, your host, Alex Steed. How are you doing out there? How's it going out in your life? Thank you if you listened to our Bell Witch episodes. That was so much fun to put together. And I'm so glad to be making this show again. And I was like, I'm going to start making the show again. I'll put 50 to 60 hours of research into investigating and talking about the Bell Witch. I hope that you appreciate it. I got some really lovely feedback, and I appreciate that. If you like the show, or you like listening to me for whatever reason, I have another show called You Are Good, which I co-host with my friend Sarah Marshall of the show You're Wrong About. And we call this show that we have, You Are Good, we call it a feelings podcast about movies. I hope you will check it out. This week, we talk about Thor Ragnarok. And next week, we're going to talk about Raising Arizona. And last week, we talked about Mamma Mia, Here We Go Again. We talk about all sorts of movies as a way to get to the bottom of our feelings. So please join us there at You Are Good. This show, Nashville Demystified, is a part of the We Own This Town network of Nashville-based podcasts. We are so grateful to them. There's a show on that network called Filmography Club. And if you are a fan of movies, this is exactly the podcast for you. I've been a guest on that show. I got to talk about one of my favorites. I got to talk about It Follows. And Jason Sean, who is a film critic for The Scene and a gentleman about town. Gentleman About Town sounds ridiculous. Is a film-oriented bon vivant. I don't know if that's true, but I love Jason. Jason's great. Has been on this show in the past. We talked about the movie Nashville, and Jason joins host Jason Cavanis as their most recent guest. So it's a wonderful show. Check out the shows on the We Own This Town network. Check out Filmography Club. Nashville Demystified is made possible with support by Knack Factory, a commercial and creative video content production company based in Portland, Maine, and now with offices in Nashville, Tennessee. And it does work throughout these United States. If you need that sort of work made, get in touch with the folks at Knack Factory. They do a good job, in my humble opinion. Finally, in case you're wondering what we'll be covering on the next show, I am so excited to interview Caitlin Rose. Caitlin has been a voice on this show. We did a David Berman tribute last year. Just love David Berman, but we did a David Berman tribute on the show last year, and Caitlin lent us her voice. A bunch of wonderful local folks lent us their voice for that. But I adore everything Caitlin does and makes, and just her music is wonderful. She's great. So I'm so happy she's finally going to be on the show. Accompanied by Lonnie Hutchins, she is going to be playing her first show in a few years at the 5 Spot on November 27th of this very year of 2021. It's the Saturday after Thanksgiving. I'm so psyched for that. This interview will be out a few days beforehand, so that's what you can be looking for in the next show. Caitlin will be on the show, and I could not be happier. I've also been researching, not in the next show, but coming up, I've been researching 20th century baby stealing operations in the state, and sex work in the 19 teens and how morality and concern about mental malady, how all of these things play together. It all came from me taking a walk around the cemetery the other day and looking things up accordingly. I'm excited to dive into those hot topics, those hot button issues of yesteryear and relevant today, and putting something together for your ears. So, keep an eye open, keep an ear to the ground. No, not to the ground. Keep an ear to your headphones or however you're listening. All right, back to Steven. I can't say enough good things about Steven Hale and his overall journalism career and the cover story he wrote for last week's Nashville Scene. It was called The Other Epidemic. Fentanyl is killing people in Nashville at a staggering rate. And it's true. The reporting is there. You should check out the piece if you have not already. We talk about the piece here and about how some of the realities around drug overdoses have changed in the past few years. We discussed this within, but I had, until relatively recently, thought that I understood what the various epidemics look like, particularly around opioids. Like many, I've lost many friends to the opioid epidemic, or peers or folks that I went to school with. I've lost many, many people in my life to this fucking monster. And, it's just been raging for years, for decades now. And I've been hooked on pills, and I've had family that's been hooked and in and out of rehab and in and out of homelessness. And, I've seen this thing like so many of us have, and I've seen this thing take its toll on entire towns and entire regions and entire economies. And without a bit of humor in this conversation, I remark about how I've long equated that version of the opioid epidemic with like the actual zombie apocalypse. Like, we're waiting for this thing to happen, but it is happening in one way or another. Like, it is a thing that takes lives. It's born in a lab out of a mix of like greedy corporatism and corporate influenced lax regulation by way of government. And it just takes over brains and the agency of people who we know and love. And it's horrendous. And it has been horrendous again for decades since I was a teenager. It's just massive, and it's deadly, and it's devastating in scale. And we've all lost folks to that ongoing epidemic. And what Steven discusses within is that is still going on, of course, but the addition of accidental fentanyl deaths, and how fentanyl is cut with both opioids and opioid-based drugs and oxys, it's just all of everything in that family. And also in counterfeit iterations of like any number of other drugs. This is what's going on, and this is how things have changed. And this is ultimately boosting overdoses across the board, broadening the profile of people who are overdosing. And Steven makes great pains to emphasize this throughout this conversation. This is not to say this is serious now because it's not just happening to people who are, quote, addicted to drugs, like to drug addicts. And I'm saying that in air quotes. But it's important to note because the population of those potentially affected is now increasingly and just exponentially varied. It's kind of blown up over a very short period of time. And so the people that this affects has broadened, and a lot of people, including myself, don't even necessarily fully grasp how serious it is. And as Steven says, this affects you if you are a person who uses a drug that is not prescribed to you, or knows someone who does. So that is all of us. That is everybody. And we all know someone, and there's a chance that we know many people, or we are those people. And I am sometimes that person, or have been that person. So yeah, a lot of this conversation, it's a lovely conversation because again, I adore Steven, but it's a frightening conversation, and it's worth listening to. We talk about a lot of different stuff in here. And so one thing I want to say is if we were having a conversation that was more specific about the opioid epidemic, we'd have talked much more about issues relating to harm reduction, which is something I'm incredibly interested in which there are a number of barriers in the state of Tennessee. And we discuss how those barriers are even creating issues with this particular problem. Harm reduction generally is something I'd like to cover deeper in future episodes. Please don't think that because we didn't touch on it more extensively here means that that isn't something that's at least important to me or something that we don't want to cover. We want to cover this in a broader way. And this conversation is a start of doing that. One other thing we talk about is we discuss how pre-existing police rhetoric in the so-called war on drugs has made it a bit of a boy cried wolf problem, more than a bit of a boy cried wolf problem in reporting on this most recent iteration of this issue. And as Steven does in his piece, he goes into great detail about the diversity of agencies and experiences and folks that he's encountered in his reporting on this, that report that this is a thing to be concerned about. This is a thing that is happening. And I've already said it, but I just want to say it one more time. We say it over and over and over in this conversation. I just want to underscore it one more time. No one who dies by way of a drug-related death is more or less valuable than another person because of the shape of their addiction or because of their relationship with drugs. Were they more or less addicted than another person? Were they more of a casual user or someone who is more deeply addicted? These are all people, and everyone matters. Everyone matters. We are just describing a different changing landscape that is responsible for an increasing amount of deaths. So I just want to make sure that that is clear in case it is confusing in any way. I've been here. A lot of people I know and love have been here, and it has looked many different ways for many different people. I just want to make sure that that is as clear as it can possibly be. You know, we've just lost great people, and the shapes and contours of their relationship with drugs are all different. It doesn't make them any less great. Finally, we recorded this conversation in a busy office, and you'll hear some of that. It's not too bad. I would say it's not too bad for a person who is not a professional producer. I mean, I'm actually a professional video producer, but for a person who's not a professional sound guy, I think it turned out great. But just a heads up, you'll hear some of that busyness going on in the background. It's like a real scene. I like it a lot. It's exciting. Okay, that's enough from me. Let's go ahead and talk with Steven. And by the way, thanks so much for listening to Nashville Demystified. I appreciate you very much. I'm glad you're here. Hello.
Hello.
What's up, Steven?
Not much. Good to be back with you.
You're my first repeat guest.
Oh, that's an honor. That's an honor.
I appreciate it.
Glad you're back at it and back in the state.
We talk about very lighthearted things.
Yeah, only the cheeriest stuff. Someday we will pick a better topic.
Someday we'll talk about something that like there's just like a general nerdery about.
Yes.
If you go, I mean, I understand that we collectively have not really been going to dinner parties, but if you go to a dinner party and people go around the circle of like what you do and what you focus on or whatever, how do you describe who you are and what you do?
I usually just tell them I'm a reporter for the Nashville Scene, staff writer. I guess it depends how deep into it they want to go. The honest answer is that if I'm in the middle of working on something, for better or worse, they probably end up hearing a lot about that. If I'm in between stuff, it's probably more of like, I do a little bit of everything, write about some, and I give them kind of a briefer summary. So it probably depends on the timing.
What is your, like, what do you consider your beat?
Right now, it's mostly criminal justice related stuff, something that is at least tangentially related to that, although not completely. I mean, even this most recent story that I have out is, I guess, has an angle there. I think a lot of this other stuff I've done has been kind of about the rapidly changing city and the effects that has had on it. I've written about kind of the lower Broadway scene, which is a little more upbeat, it's bizarre, but it's a little more fun. It's not life or death. But I always look at those stories as kind of being about the changing city and some of the some of those stories are just a window into how the city's changing and what that looks like.
Yeah. I want to get to the story that you have out today, but I'm curious about, does the city know how it's changed yet in the past 20 years? Like, is there a simple synopsis of like, it was this way in the year 2001 and it's this way now?
That's an interesting question. I don't know if the city has a grasp on it. I mean, there was a time when, and I kind of, this is sort of right after I got here. I moved here around 2010, and there was a period, right after that, in and around the period of the infamous now New York Times It City article. You heard a lot of people being like, oh, if the New York Times ever mentioned Nashville, people talked about it. It was kind of like people were still getting used to the idea of Nashville being this more major city. And then that kind of started to curdle, I think, a little into, okay, well, now people are annoyed at the, national publications that write about the city, but that don't seem to get it quite right. Or people are irritated that GQ does some story about a bar in East Nashville and it just supercharges the gentrification that's going on, or, and so I think there started to be kind of a change there. And now, I think people probably are more aware of it. The housing, I think it's fair to say, affordability crisis, really. Yeah. I mean, it's not San Francisco, but it's not great. It's hard to find an affordable place to live.
Yeah.
And that is one way that it has really changed. And also we're seeing how that changes just the culture of the city. I mean, we're losing places that have been here for years because the ground they're built on is being, sold or being developed or whatever. And I don't want to be naive about it. That happens, change happens, but it's definitely, it's just had a lot of effect. I mean, it's all around. And then the tourism. I mean, Nashville has always been for a long time has been had a tourist economy and relied on people coming here with country music and all that. But there's a difference between that and, the party tub. It's just a different vibe. I mean, when I got here and people said Nash Vegas, it was sort of like ironic, it was like a joke. And now it's like down Lower Broadway sort of feels that way.
Yeah, so. I hadn't. So, I mean, I just got back recently, as you know, but I hadn't been back for a year and a half. And I mean, even in that, it's a small amount of time to be gone. And Lower Broadway feels more like Hollywood Boulevard than and it's always obviously busy, and it's always obviously bustling in one way or another, and an attraction for tourists or whatever. But there's like there's like the Apple Block. And it really, on some level, like that Apple Block to like where that new Hattie B's is, like it really does feel like Hollywood Boulevard. Like it feels like an entirely, obviously, like slightly different energy, slightly different intensity, but like it looks and feels. That part looks and feels, and we did a series on this show about the change of Lower Broadway from 78 to 90. So I understand that what it looked like a year and a half ago looks radically different than it did before too.
Right.
But it's fascinating how quickly those changes take hold. And I imagine it's really interesting to see while you're reporting from the inside of it. And it's also really interesting to go away for a little while and come back and see.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And you're right. I mean, people who have spent their whole lives here have an interesting perspective because they remember when downtown was just a place that no one went. Forget residents, just no one would go down there because why would you? It was just sort of seedy or nothing to do there. That was fun. And, it's sort of, we've kind of gone all the way through the other end where now I don't know anyone who lives here who would go down there just because it's wild. It sort of makes you sound kind of basic to say it, but it's just madness down there. It's crazy. So it's like, it's just, you don't want to get caught up in it. But.
Yeah. So tell me about your piece today that came out today in the Scene, and tell me sort of what the issues in there, how they fit into a changing city.
Well, so I guess just a little bit of how it came about. I mean, people might be familiar for a while now, but I particularly started noticing this year. The Metro Public Health Department will put out these alerts. It's kind of interesting. The pandemic has sort of made us all used to the idea of an outbreak happening, and you see on the news, there was an outbreak of an infection over here, and they started putting out these alerts of overdose outbreaks, basically, where there would be a spike in drug deaths, and they would just be kind of warning people. And I think it's interesting. It's an idea that may sound weird at first to some people, like, why would you need to warn people about that? But what was happening was there would be areas in the city where there would be like a quick spike in deaths related to name a drug. You know, there would be meth, and it would be cut with fentanyl. And so they would put out a warning that would just say, reduce your dose, don't use alone. If you have access to Narcan, you know, use that, which, if people aren't familiar, Narcan is the drug that can kind of reverse an opioid overdose. Mm-hmm. And so we started seeing these alerts go out and kind of hearing anecdotally about a rise in drug deaths. But it hadn't gotten a whole lot of attention. I mean, other than Metro Public Health putting it out and Metro Police every once in a while announcing that they'd made some busts of 15, 20, 50 pounds of this stuff. And so we wanted to do a story on that. And that's kind of what led to doing the story today, which is just about, I mean, it's called The Other Epidemic because it's just about this crisis that's been running in parallel to COVID, and started before COVID really, but has been running parallel to COVID and has been killing more people every year and is going to kill more people this year than it did last, and if nothing changes next year than it did this year. So
one of the lines that stuck out in the story to me is and the reason this stuck out is like my whole adulthood, I feel like, has been defined by there being an ongoing, evolving opioid crisis in one way or another. I mean, I moved to Portland, Maine when I was 17, and there was a piece in, I think, Spin that upon the month of my arrival that talked about Portland at that point being the highest concentration of OxyContin used in the country. And obviously that banner went to many different locations over the past 20 years.
Right.
It was like in the quiet before Portland's like substantial gentrification storm. And I'm curious to know, so the line that I was talking about in the story is like, this is a different crisis than, like, starting in around 2018, this is a different crisis than the one that we're used to. And to me,
right.
It feels a little shocking because it has always felt vaguely apocalyptic. Like, I feel like the opioid crisis is our zombie apocalypse in one way or another. It fits kind of all of the bills. Like, it's like a lab created, it creates a dependency, it creates for some people who aren't able to get out. I mean, it creates death. Like, it's
right.
It's terrible. It's a terrible thing. But I didn't realize that, like, it had entered kind of like a new phase. So, like, what is the shape of that? Yeah,
I mean, if you talk to the Metro Public Health folks who are following this, as I did, they will tell you that, and they showed me these graphs where you can see, podcasting is a visual medium, I'm here using my hands, but you can see the opioid overdoses going down. And fentanyl is an opioid, it's a synthetic opioid, but meaning prescription opioid overdoses going down and fentanyl taking off. And the real way that it's changed is that fentanyl's showing up in everything now. This will be an oversimplification, but for an example, if during the opioid crisis, if one thing that you saw was people becoming addicted to their prescription pills and maybe overdosing that way or developing a dependency or eventually turning to heroin, say, this sort of almost become a stereotypical story that you hear. And like I said, I admittedly is simplifying it, but for a lot of us, that's how we started hearing about fentanyl. It was in the heroin, and so people were turning to heroin, and then sometimes they were overdosing on heroin. Well, now, even the heroin deaths have gone down. It's not so much heroin anymore, but it's fentanyl started showing up in cocaine, started showing up in meth, started showing up in pills, and in a lot of counterfeit pills. So people think they're taking a Xanax from a friend, and it's fentanyl. And so the change is that this is now hitting, yes, people who are struggling with addiction, but also people who are casual drug users or first-time users, you know, someone who doesn't even think of themselves as someone who's using drugs. I mean, they may take an Adderall from a friend, and I'm not, you know, just trying to scaremonger. I mean, this fentanyl has been showing up in all this stuff to varying degrees. MDMA, you know, people take ecstasy, and there's fentanyl showing up in that. So that's how it's changed. And again, I don't want to say this in a stigmatizing way. Any drug death is something we should work to avoid. Addiction is something we should work to address. People who are struggling with addiction, it's not that we should be dismissive of that, but it is a difference in the type of crisis we're dealing with, where it's not just, you know, we were seeing the overprescribing of opioids and people getting addicted that way, and now you have it just spans the whole spectrum of anyone who might use almost any type of drug.
Yeah. Yeah, that scares the shit out of me.
It's really frightening, yeah. And that's why the deaths have spiked, because, as the public health folks put it, and to their credit, I mean, they're very humane. They, I think, have some reticence about talking about it this way because it can sound cold. But again, as I was talking to them, they would emphasize, every drug death matters to us. We are working to stop as many of these as we can. But because of the crisis now, the universe of potential deaths is much larger. There will be people who listen to this who will never consider using heroin. They might consider taking a pill from a friend.
Right.
I
have taken a pill from a friend.
In general, those, I'm not saying there's no overlap between those people, but in general, those might be two groups of people that the circles don't overlap.
Totally.
Now this crisis can affect both.
Right.
And so it's way more people,
right,
who are potentially at risk.
Right. When you're dealing with different populations that are potentially at risk, like, you're not dealing with just one approach. You're dealing with a number of levels of approaches to get in front of people, to sort of curb an issue, to inform, to
Right. I want to keep emphasizing, because I hate the idea that anyone would think that there's somehow a reason to be dismissive of the previous crisis or any death of anyone for any reason. I mean, I don't care if a person's has become addicted to heroin. We should, that's an important person, an important problem. It's just that this is different, and the way that it's different makes the death toll potentially higher.
Well, I was telling you off mic earlier that I have a friend in law enforcement who a couple of years ago, around 2000, I believe this was around 2018, maybe early 2019, who was saying that within the agency he works in, his focus pivoted at some point very quickly to just monitoring incoming, I think, like dark web shipments that were coming from China in particular, because that's where a lot of fentanyl, at that point, I don't know how much this has changed, but like at that point, a lot of fentanyl had come in, and it was not like that. It was like, let's focus on fentanyl or the destination. It was specifically, it was manifesting in counterfeit pills. And I think like what a lot of people don't realize with regard to the counterfeit pill situation is like, you can think that you're getting one thing, and really you're basically just getting like a crushed up powder that has like a touch of fentanyl in it. And you're dealing with people who are creating that mix, often unscientifically.
Yeah,
so,
you're not talking about chemists or pharmacists. I mean, these are people.
So like the equivalent
using
is like
a blender.
Yeah, exactly. And the equivalent is like if you accidentally get that cookie that has like a wad of butter in there, like you get that equivalent in a pill, like you're dead. Like that's and I think like a lot of people don't realize that is how
I mean, honestly, we maybe would have done this story sooner, except that my editor Patrick and I and other people on staff talked a lot about it, because I did not want to do a purely like fear mongering story. I mean, because we've all seen the sort of panic that happens around some of these things. You don't want to just do that, and it's hard to talk about this without sounding that way. But I mean, we have the picture in the story, but a lot of people will have seen it, of a penny and then a lethal dose of fentanyl. And it's remarkably small.
Right.
And I mean, my wife's a nurse, and people who work in the medical field will be familiar with fentanyl being used in medical circumstances, of course, in an appropriate setting. And in those settings, you're talking about micrograms of fentanyl. A lethal dose of fentanyl can be 2 milligrams, which is already small, but we're talking about incredibly small doses of this stuff that is so potent. To speak about it in sort of crude terms, I mean, you could just do a whole bag of drugs and be fine, but at the very end, it's a little bit of this stuff, it'll kill you. Even if you were trying to do fentanyl, which a lot of people, of course, are not, but you would have no way of trusting that it's been evenly distributed amongst your supply. Like, that's just not what you're talking about,
Right. And I think the reason I bring it up is I think a lot of people get confused and think that people are seeking fentanyl.
Right.
And that it has been, they've like sort of, they've gone from heroin, which some people are actually like lamenting the good old days of when you could just get heroin. Right?
Yes.
So like you're going from heroin, like people, I think that some people think that there are just people who are like, time to get big, and they go and get fentanyl. And it's like, no, it's like, it is, these overdose deaths are often coming from it just appearing places where people don't expect it to.
Yeah, you're exactly right. I mean, police detective I talked to told me, you're not getting heroin anymore. You're not getting what you think you're getting. And yeah, you're right. I think there was a time maybe when some people who were addicted to heroin would knowingly use heroin that had some fentanyl in it, because those two drugs are more similar and it would sort of increase the sort of potency. But yeah, for the most part, you have people now who have no idea or reason to believe that what they're taking has fentanyl in it, and it just does. The other thing that I want to mention, because I think it's really helps clarify the issue for people, I spoke to a woman, her name is Tanya Jacobs. She lost her son to a fentanyl death. He took what he thought was cocaine, and it was fentanyl, and he died. She told me, will you please be someone who doesn't use the word overdose, but uses the word fentanyl poisoning, or I mean, she said, or murder, you know? And we could talk about some of the prosecutions that have happened in these cases too. But the reason she said that, and I thought all about it, is because people get, when you use the word overdose, and it's hard to avoid in some circumstances using that word. And technically it's true, but when you hear the word overdose, what a lot of people think is they imagine someone who's been struggling with addiction and pushes the limit too far, or some multi-day bender that ends up killing someone. But with fentanyl, these deaths are not happening that way. They're happening with someone taking a dose of something that would never have killed them, almost certainly wouldn't have killed them, if not for the fact that there's fentanyl in it. And so I think, she made a good point that the word overdose can kind of give people the wrong idea and make them imagine that this is only happening to people in a back alley somewhere. Again, those people matter, but it's easier for people to dismiss if they think it's just something happening far away, to people that, oh, well, I don't do heroin, so this, I don't have to think about that.
Right.
But these deaths are different in that way. They're not overdoses in the sense that we might traditionally think of them.
Yeah, it's so interesting too, like speaking to what you were trying to avoid earlier in the reporting, is you're like, I don't want to contribute to a scare. My experience with law enforcement telling me about drugs is not not one where I have a lot of trust, right?
Absolutely.
So, but now I'm sure
for good reason.
Yes, for a history, and so the interesting issue is you kind of have like a cried wolf situation, in that now people who are like, no, just so you know, like any drugs can potentially have fentanyl, you can be poisoned as a result. A lot of the people who've been telling you that in one way or another, it has become hard to trust them, and so we now have this issue where I think people who this message applies to, which is literally anyone who takes any drug that is not prescribed to them at all,
right, or knows anyone who does, which. Yes. Okay, so that's basically everyone.
Basically everyone, yeah. They feel skeptical of the message coming at them.
That's totally fair. And I think that's also one reason why we really wanted to focus on a lot of the public health folks who are trying to fight this. Now, granted, public health officials, that's become polarizing, because we're also in a pandemic where the messaging of that hasn't always been great. But we wanted it to be a story that focused a lot on public health. Not just law enforcement. Honestly, because of that, the law enforcement folks I talked to for this story, their devotion to their jobs and trying to stop these drugs coming in was palpable. I don't question their sincerity or their dedication. But yeah, we've all seen how that story can be framed. And there are some ways where I think it warps the story in a way that makes it wrong, makes it not as accurate as it could be. Whereas the way that the public health folks talk about this is, they have an epidemiologist who is working on tracking this. It's very similar in that way to outbreaks of a viral outbreak. It can spread in communities. When you see a cluster of them happening over, drug deaths happening in one area, much the way that we might respond to an outbreak of COVID in an area, they will send folks out to that area, try to get them Narcan, try to talk to people, try to inform people so that they know. And they'll tell you this, the public health folks. It's triage right now. They know they're not, it's a tidal wave, and they know they're not going to stop it by standing there, but they're trying to reduce deaths if they can and how they can. They know they're not going to stop people from using drugs on their own. They're not going to talk people out of that. What they are trying to do is make it so that if people do use drugs, they don't die.
You'd said in the piece, which was striking, that overlapping a graph of COVID deaths and overlapping a graph of the deaths that you're describing now, it's a near identical number, a very close number. But the issue here with these drug deaths or with the fentanyl poisonings, that there's no flattening of the curve. It's still whereas COVID is shifting and infections, this is just still going up.
Yeah, I have it right in front of me. So from some first COVID death in Nashville was March 20th, 2020. Between March 20th, 2020 and October 16th, 2021, so that's a couple weeks ago, there were 1,113 COVID deaths reported in Nashville. In that same time period, there were 1,070 suspected drug deaths that occurred in the county. Now, that the drug death number includes residents and non-residents. It's just deaths that did occur in the county, so it's not the exact same. I mean, but, it's pretty close. It's pretty close to the same amount of people died in this county of COVID and of drug deaths, most of them being related to fentanyl. And so it's pretty striking. The public health folks will tell you that they already were projecting drug deaths to increase in 2020, even before the pandemic. The pandemic, I guess I'll leave to other people whether this is totally just correlation or causation, how that it's hard to break down how much of it is due to the pandemic. But in 2020, it ended up being higher than they were thinking it was going to be. And, they might have expected an increase anyway, but the pandemic did correlate with more of an increase than was expected, which is sadly, I don't think, shocking, given the effect that the pandemic's had on people's mental health, isolation, all these things. But yeah, I mean, it's pretty striking that we have this parallel crisis going on that is killing a similar amount of people.
It was fascinating. I saw so many parts of my life and lived experience in this story, not just because I certainly spent a period as a person who had a pills issue, but also as what was the young man's name who worked in the restaurant Tyler. That's whenever I know a younger person who's like just getting into the restaurant industry, I'm just like, be careful, because the restaurant industry is great and I loved it, and it was how I spent much of my life working, but it is a place where there are a lot of drugs. And particularly if this is an issue now, and you think that it's just recreational, and often it is just recreational, it could end poorly, very sadly. And I know a lot of people in that industry who we've lost in the past, for sure, 10 to 20 years from abuse, from exposure. But increasingly now I've been reading about people in communities I know who are passing for the same reason. Yeah.
And I know there's a push among people in the community, including one person I interviewed who appears at the end of the piece, talking about trying to get Narcan, fentanyl test strips and stuff into more of the restaurant, bar, venue scene, because these are subcultures where drug use is more common. And just kind of being pragmatic about that and going, okay, if we know that, let's try to take some harm reduction steps in those areas. And, because you think about it, if you work at a bar, you got to take courses to make sure that you can sell alcohol. Why not also take a Narcan training class? Yeah. And it's not about stigmatizing the restaurant industry, but it's just a thing we know that there are drugs in that. There are drugs in lots of places. Totally. Venues, shows and stuff. These are places that it would be great to have some of these resources, and of course to also be ready to offer people who might be struggling with addiction, resources to get help with that as well. Yeah, because that's of course a big part of it still, even though this is affecting people, even people who aren't struggling with addiction. It's definitely going to make it much riskier to be addicted to drugs now, because the drugs that you go seeking could end up killing you. So,
right. You talked to a number of public health officials in your story. What is the education effort look like? How is this mess? I mean, obviously there's a piece in the Scene this week, but how are people learning about this?
Yeah, now? So it's interesting because I think they have been hesitant to share some data sometimes publicly because they don't want to stigmatize certain neighborhoods. So they don't want to put out a map that says, here are the hot spots in Nashville for drug deaths, because they don't want people to get the idea that, that street is just a drug den, And so they do a lot of that work behind the scenes, where they just use that data themselves and go try to respond to those areas with, informing people in those areas, going to businesses in those areas, So if there's a strip in some neighborhood where there's businesses and restaurants and there's been a cluster of drug deaths, they'll send people out there, try to get them to carry Narcan in their stores or in their businesses, give them information about it, just make sure they're aware that this problem is going on, and that kind of thing. So it's in that way, it's kind of this just sort of grassroots on the ground thing that it's been happening. And then they put out these alerts. There's a program, it's called the Spike program, I believe. When there's a spike in overdose deaths, you can sign up. We have the information in the story, but you can sign up to get text alerts. So the public health department will text you saying there's been a spike in drug overdoses related to, sometimes they'll say what the drug was, sometimes they'll say, depending on the circumstances. And so that's one way they're doing it too.
What was outside, it sounds like there's a lot that was surprising in this piece, but like, what was a bit that surprised you the most outside of the numbers? I assume were huge.
Yeah. I mean, one thing is just, this has been out there, but just talking to people about it, realizing how this stuff is showing up in every drug that they find was surprising. Another surprising thing that when I interviewed an assistant district attorney and a police detective who does some undercover work and stuff, and he told me they've seen dealers giving out Narcan to their customers, which is just quite a statement of just the level of awareness that this has changed. And I mean, the other thing was just, so I interviewed this woman named Candace Sexton. She's the director of investigations at the Middle Tennessee Regional Forensic Center. They serve as the medical examiner's office for Davidson County, but also do autopsy services for 52 counties in and around Middle Tennessee. I mean, there's no easy way to say this. Their morgue is basically overflowing as a result of this crisis. I mean, I went and visited to interview her, and they have an outdoor refrigerated truck forgive the sort of crude way of saying it, but for sort of overflow for bodies. And that's full. They also have a FEMA truck, which they got originally for the pandemic. But this office doesn't deal with that many COVID deaths because a lot of those happen under the care of a doctor and don't require a medical examiner. So it's third of the way full too, and the strain they're feeling is because of the drug deaths. So there were a lot of stories the past year and a half about morgues filling up from COVID, which obviously were true. But in this case, the strain they're feeling and just the stress and the way the staff is overwhelmed there is because of the drug deaths, and that was kind of shocking.
So with COVID, right? Like I know a number of people from my hometown didn't believe in it, right? Like didn't believe it was a thing, didn't believe it was an issue or whatever. And, then someone who everyone knew would do a stint in the hospital, and that has a PR element to it, right? Like there's a like once this guy, does 9 to whatever 13 days on a ventilator, like that is an alert that this is an issue, right? And ideally they make it through, and the issue with COVID was filling the hospital, sort of straining the resources or whatever. And it seems like an issue here is like people just die. People are alive, and then they encounter the fentanyl poisoning, and then they die relatively immediately. And there isn't that kind of like, oh, this is in
there's not time for it to wake people up. Yeah.
Right. Because what people do psychologically when someone immediately dies is they disassociate in one way or another. Like that was them. They had like this issue, whatever. And so I think it becomes a hard thing to create a resonance with a lot of people.
I will say it's one interesting overlap with the pandemic is, and again, it's so hard to talk about some of this stuff and not sound cold. Even through the pandemic, when people were talking about a strain on resources, you feel like, well, we're talking about people. We don't want to talk about that way. But it is a problem for people. If the hospital is full, it's a problem for the person that gets in a car accident.
Right.
Well, with this spike in drug deaths, Metro Public Health folks told me that EMS right now is doing around 20 runs a day for suspected drug overdose calls. So it's a strain on those resources too. And not all those people die, thankfully. Sometimes EMS shows up and they can give the person Narcan and revive them. So luckily some of these are non-fatal calls, but still,
right.
It's to that level where it is a strain on some of the resources for sure.
Yeah.
And again, I don't mean strain as in like, obviously those people deserve help, but it's just, that's the level of problem we're dealing with where it is a noticeable area for their resources. And you just think about, between 2016 and 2020 in Nashville, drug deaths doubled, a little more than doubled. I mean, if you just imagine if homicides more than doubled in a 3-year period, we're seeing what happens when you have a spike in homicides in terms of it's a national news story, And to be fair, the opioid overdose crisis is an ongoing federal public health emergency. I mean, it has been declared a public emergency. Right. But just to say, like, it's a crisis on that level. It's just that for whatever reason, people, myself included, it wasn't necessarily on our radar.
Yeah. I know that you're a journalist. I'm not asking you to speak to like the political positions here, but at what level are political narratives around this barriers to the ways that we talk about or intervene or,
I mean, I think one barrier is that a lot of our drug policies are based on the idea of abstinence. Mm. One example is the fentanyl test strips that I've mentioned in this conversation. State law considers those drug paraphernalia. Mm. So now in Nashville, the prosecutors and the police are not charging people for having those right now, but it's still, under state law, it's drug paraphernalia. It complicates it for Metro Public Health folks to get them because it's illegal. You can get them, but it complicates the issue. And of course, in some sense, it is drug paraphernalia. You're only going to have them if you're using drugs. But of course, the point of them is to make sure you don't unknowingly take fentanyl. So that's an example where our policy is oriented toward sort of criminalizing anything that might be seen as encouraging or enabling drug use. Whereas the reality is that people are using drugs, they're just dying from it. And the public health folks are saying, look, if you're going to use, don't use alone, have Narcan. If you can get fentanyl test strips, get them and use them. Mm-hmm. So the approach they're taking is harm reduction. One of, this is happening, and let's try to minimize the damage that is done to people when it happens. Yeah. Sure, in the long term, if there's some way to solve people's addictions or to... I mean, this gets into bigger conversations about our society. Why are people turning to drugs in some cases? Mm-hmm. Probably for a number of reasons. Setting aside recreational use, but just why are people... Even that, I mean, why do people seeking out a certain... I don't know, whether it's to relax or to relieve stress or whatever, that gets into all these broader conversations. But I think that's one small example where you can see that the policy is oriented in a way that is just not aligned with what's happening on the ground. Mm-hmm. The other is that... I say this, I didn't write it meaning it to be a particularly like hot take. I think it's just true. But, the Metro Police seized 50 pounds of suspected fentanyl a while back. It's enough to kill, hypothetically, 11 million people.
Yeah, it's like a
nuclear bomb.
It's like a nuclear
it's And so, speaking back to the way that the connotation of police talking about drugs and maybe scaring people. I mean, do the math. It's 11 million people it could kill if 2 milligrams is a lethal dose. They're not lying when they say that's a scary amount of drugs. Mm-hmm. It's one of those things. It's the exception that proves the rule. They seized those drugs. It's a victory for Metro Police to seize 50 pounds of lethal drugs. But they'll tell you it's a fraction of what's coming in. Those seizures are, in a way, are evidence of the failure of our broader policy of we're not keeping this stuff out. I mean, we're just not. It's coming in, and these detectives are dedicated. I spoke to them, and they'll tell you they know that it's coming in more than they can stop it all. Yeah. And I don't pretend to know the silver bullet to fix all that, but it's just that is the case right now. Mm.
What is your biggest takeaway here? What should people walk away with? I
think my biggest takeaway is that. If you are, I don't know my biggest takeaway is just that this is happening on a scale that a while ago I wasn't aware of. Mm. More people dying, more people almost dying. But beyond that, my biggest takeaway I think would be that if you are someone who, for whatever reason, you just don't use drugs or your life is such that you're not in that scene, you're not in a scene where you would come across it much. I have 2 young kids. I'm not out partying a lot. I'm going to a concert this week. It's my first concert in however long. It's just not. So I can speak for myself and just say it's not something I'm probably going to interact with a lot. Mm-hmm. It's not for like some high moral reason. It's just my life is not. And so it's easy. It can be easy to dismiss anything related to drugs. It's not. I don't do drugs. People I know aren't doing heroin. So overdoses are sad. They're tragic, but it's not a thing in my life. And my biggest takeaway is that is not true. I think you should care about drug issues regardless. But the point is, people are using some kind of drug casually or recreationally. If not yourself, they are at risk of using something that turns out to be fentanyl and dying. You are closer to this problem than you think, is my takeaway. Both how prevalent some kind of drug use is and how ubiquitous the fentanyl is now.
I'm going to ask you a very controversial question. What's your favorite record that's come out this year?
Ooh. That's more fun to talk about.
By the way, when you were talking earlier about the way Nashville has changed and what it means or whatever, the most controversial question I was asked this year on Twitter so people could see, and I got real squirrely about it, was a friend of mine from Maine was coming down to Nashville, and they were like, what's the best place to get hot chicken? And I was like, I've never offered a more, I talk about controversial shit all the time, I've never offered a more caveated series of responses in my entire life.
You gotta yeah, I hear that. So, this is tough. There's a few.
Yeah, you can talk about a few.
One of them that I will say is, and Joy, if you happen to hear this, forgive me, because I don't know if I'm saying her name correctly off the top here, but Joy Oladikan, her record, In Defense of My Own Happiness, which came out this year, is brilliant. Everyone should check that out if you haven't. She recently played at the Ryman, opened for Jason Isbell, and she's doing some shows. Next year she's got a show in the spring. I wish I had the date. I would tell people to buy tickets to it. She's excellent. She's local. She's great. I love the new Adia Victoria record, A Southern Gothic. People should check that out for sure. I will say a new album that just came out, I think, this week that I love and that is sort of topical is the new record from A War on Drugs.
Perfect.
Yeah. If you like The War on Drugs, you will like this album because, I mean, if you like the band The War on Drugs, you will like this album.
If you like the other one, you will hate this album. It's got the
same vibe. Yeah. It's probably not, the target demographic is probably not people who like the actual War on Drugs. But if you like the band, I'm pretty sure you'll like this album. Same vibes, and it's great.
Right on.
So there's three. There's probably more, but what about you?
Oh, record-wise? Man, I don't know. I'm so bad at this. I'm bad at keeping up. I listen to old stuff all the time. I'm so bad at keeping, though. Okay, I did see, so this is not a record answer, but because their last record was a couple of years ago, but I saw the band Totals the other day and Kings of the Fucking Sea the other day. And just, first of all, to see music, period, like it's been a long time for
thrilling.
me. So it's thrilling, but just like seeing those two bands, Totals is very like sort of drum forward and almost like trancey drum stuff, and then Kings of the Fucking Sea, like classic like 70s Aussie style metal. I love them so much.
I'm trying to remember if Bill Callahan's latest record came out this year. I think it
came out last year.
Was it last year?
Which was also an amazing record.
I love that record, but I guess that was last year. It's all blurring, but I love him.
You know what the record I like the most this year? Sorry, that was so helpful to me was the Super Wolves record that came out. Bonnie Prince Billy and Matt Sweeney record. Yeah. So that's it.
There you go.
Thanks for helping me.
Some good music.
Who are you seeing this week?
I'm seeing Dashboard Confessional at the Ryman. Dashboard Confessional and Laura Jane Grace of Against Me is opening, which I'm really happy about. I've never seen her, or I've never been able to see Against Me. I'm also from Florida, so it's a Florida band there. But yes, Dashboard Confessional was very important to me at a certain point in my life.
Of course.
And I've never seen them. Never seen Chris Carrabba, never seen him. So
I listened to Dashboard Confessional a lot in 2003, 2004.
Yeah, when everyone did.
Exactly. Worked as a barista at a coffee shop bookstore.
Oh yeah, well there you go.
Listened to that, and then went to go see that. I think that year I went to go see Against Me in Boston, maybe Somerville, something like that. And I couldn't, this is the classic, I feel like, Against Me story. Like, I couldn't go. We got there. I couldn't go. I watched someone put a cinder block through a windshield of a car, and the cops shut the thing down so, like, no one knew could go there. Like, it was a fantastic
It's almost
experience.
as good a story as if you had gotten to go to the show.
Exactly. Yeah. I can imagine what it was like.
Right. Yeah. I'm super excited about that because, like I said, I haven't gotten to see her, and I've liked the solo stuff she's put out, but and the band rules, obviously. So
yeah, fantastic.
Yeah,
awesome. Well, enjoy.
I will, dude. I'm glad we did this.
Yeah, man. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
All right, everybody, that is it for this episode of Nashville Demystified. Thank you so much to Cameron Davidson for producing this episode. Thanks to Knack Factory for underwriting it. Thanks to We Own This Town for distributing it. Thanks to the Nashville Public Library for not thinking I'm weird for just sitting and reading old magazines and publications all the time. appreciate you. I don't know. That's it for now. That was a lot. That was a big one. I'm glad we ended talking about some music. I thought that was lovely. Thanks to Steven Hale for being out there doing the thing that he does. I'm glad he shared a bit of it with us. All right. Take care, everybody.